the law under which he put these tariffs in place doesn't give him the power to do so. So it's clearly a complete misuse of the Emergency Powers Act. This will look, after the fact, very bad for the U.S. that achieved very little in terms of substantial economic concessions from our trading partners.
Some of Trump's tariffs have been struck down by a court. The ruling applies to the measures he introduced under emergency legislation, the court saying he overstepped his authority. Well, joining me now is Meredith Crowley, Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge, who specialises in trade policy. Thank you very much for joining us. How significant is this ruling?
This is a big ruling. This is a major setback to President Trump's agenda. It was not unexpected. A very simple reading of the Constitution in the United States by non-experts makes it clear Congress has the authority to regulate taxes on international trade. What the ruling says is that, the president, in using for most of the tariffs imposed something called the Emergency Powers Act, has clearly overstepped his authority. And it also says, within the context of the ruling, that there are times when Congress can give the president some authority to make trade policy, but these have to be under clearly defined guidelines. So there are parts of U.S. law that give the president some powers. If he wants to use those powers going forward, there's no restriction on these limited powers. But this broad sweep approach is just completely ruled out as unconstitutional.
Okay, I think that's a good kind of framework to establish what's going on here. But what was it specifically about the way that he did things that was illegal in terms of his justification for the tariffs and whether that was allowable under the emergency legislation that he used?
Okay, so under the U.S. Emergency Powers Act, it doesn't give the president authority to broadly have control over the entire U.S. tariff schedule. So there's clearly no legislation that gives him any legal authority to do what he did in applying, 10% broad tariffs on all U.S. imports from all partners. And also, even in the case of China, the idea that he's set all of these tariffs just broadly at very high rates without any clear economic justification. There's sort of two parts to what the court has said. One is he didn't really lay out any clear justification for what he's done. But more importantly, they just say the law under which he put these tariffs in place doesn't give him the power to do so. So it's clearly a complete misuse of the Emergency Powers Act, because the law that really counts is the U.S. Constitution, which says only Congress can set tariffs.
Right, because he had justified this emergency as being due to fentanyl flowing into the country. And the court basically said, well, the tariffs that you had applied, broad tariffs across the whole world, just goes far beyond the justification that you gave for this emergency. So I thought was very interesting. But talking about the impact then, how will this affect trade? Are you expecting the floodgates to suddenly open, or is there going to be plenty of caution at first as this kind of shakes out? I mean, there's an appeal in the system as well, and we don't know how that will turn out. And also, Trump in general has been quite erratic when it comes to setting trade policy.
Yeah, so my speculation here is if we look ahead, this is a specialized court, the Court of International Trade, which decides all trade-related matters in U.S. law. The next step is going up. They're really a specialist court, and I think their reading of this will be deferred to by higher level courts. So this is a pretty solid ruling, I would say. The Trump administration will appeal. I don't think we will see more tariffs under this Emergency Powers Act. That said, the Trump administration has other options going forward. So what I would expect is for traders right now who have merchandise they would like to send to the United States, U.S. firms that need inputs, I would expect a big rush, a big surge of imports coming into the United States before Trump has time to institute new tariffs under other legal authority. So just, to give one example, we have in the United States Section 201 of the 1974 Trade Act, President George W. Bush used that back in 2001 to impose broad restrictions on the imports of steel into the United States. The legal requirements to use that authority within U.S. law, they're pretty free, and the president can announce that he wants this investigation to begin, and then pretty quickly he can impose tariffs if certain economic criteria are identified, such as the threat of serious increase in imports or imports from a particular destination or the whole world, causing substantial damage to the U.S. competing industry. So it's a pretty broad authority. Back in 2001, when President George W. Bush did this, ultimately the WTO said, you are misusing a law and we would like you to remove it. And at that point, the U.S. removed it because back in 2001, the U.S. was still quite deferential to WTO rules and norms. I don't think President Trump cares about WTO rules and norms. And so he could pretty quickly initiate an investigation under Section 201. This could result in tariffs. The tariffs could go forward, but it will probably take a little time to get that type of tariff in place. And so right now, if you are a domestic producer and you need parts, you will be rushing to try to get them in before any further trade actions can be taken. The U.S. has import restrictions on steel and aluminum, and these will continue. So those have not been, ruled in any way illegal by the Court of International Trade. So these were done as in the interest of U.S. national security. Under WTO rules and norms, when a country chooses to impose, import restrictions for reasons of national security, historically there was a sort of broad deference to a country's own sovereignty and their own statement of this problem. And so those Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, they went in, on under the first Trump administration. They were maintained by the administration of Joe Biden. So those are not being removed. And we could see, many countries will say, oh, that's silly to use, a national security motivation for these steel and aluminum tariffs. But I think there is a reasonable legal interpretation where, the courts can defer to the president's judgment in this case and some of the evidence, the importance of steel for, manufacturing base. So those will stay in place, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so just to summarize what you're saying about this 1974 Trade Act, basically it does give Trump the ability to implement tariffs outside of this emergency legislation. That's a separate thing, which he was using so far. But it's much more controlled and limited in terms of what the procedure is in order to do that, and then what types of tariffs for what kind of length of time can come out of it. So, there are still options at his disposal, basically. And then just to touch on your point that you were saying about the tariffs that remain in place, especially the likes of steel and aluminium and car duties as well. So the EU is concerned about these in particular. What impact do you think that this will have on their negotiations with the US, so that the broad emergency tariffs are gone, but that the other tariffs remain? Does this give the EU a massive, I guess it increases the power of their hand in these negotiations?
I think it doesn't increase their power dramatically, because I think that the concern that EU negotiators will continue to have is that President Trump is, particularly interested in achieving various objectives, and he's not really very concerned about hurting particular interests within the U.S. or hurting interests of certain foreign trading partners when he's pursuing an agenda. So I think within the EU, they are probably trying to do an analysis right now of if Trump decided to do a Section 201 tariff, how broad could it be against the European Union? So I think they're going to approach the negotiations with a little bit of maybe some concern about what is it that President Trump really wants from them, and how can they keep the relationship as open as possible, the trading relationship between the two countries. And I think, in some sense, they understand the rules of international trade, and even they may understand the U.S. trade law itself a little bit better than the president does, because the president's not someone who necessarily defers to, oh, this is what the law says, I have to follow it. He's a little bit more like, this is what I want to do. Somebody in my team figure out which law I can use to achieve the same. So I would think that it's not strengthening the hand of the EU very much, but because they, at some level, the other plan the president could do is he could go to the U.S. Congress and approach, the Republican senators and Congress members and say, you know what, I want to change the U.S. tariff schedule, and I want you to, under law, raise U.S. import tariffs against all trading partners, and then I want you to give me, within the context of that law, some authority to negotiate down to a level you specify, say 10%, say 0, if a trading partner agrees to a trade agreement with me. So in some sense, what the court has said is he can't just raise the tariff without congressional permission, but the U.S. Congress, and they are, somewhat swayed by the arguments President Trump is making, he could go to them tomorrow and say, I want a law that says, let's raise the U.S. tariff schedule en masse. That will be hard for him to get through. And, there's kind of, the infighting among Congress. But that's another option, that if he got Congress to approve it, he could go forward. And I think the EU will understand that is a possible backstop for him, that if they're not willing to negotiate something, that's productive for both parties, he could raise the entire tariff schedule, including against our European partners.
Okay, and in these negotiations, not just with the EU, but with other trade partners, especially the ones that where the tariffs, the other tariffs, the non-emergency tariffs, let's say, still apply, what other techniques, options does he have to keep the pressure on them that are not tariff related?
Well, he's already, made various threats about support for the war in Ukraine, which, and the entire list of, gripes that, President Trump has made, that Vice President Vance has made against the European Union, and their, lower spending on their own national security and defense. So this is sort of something that's, he can always come back to. He's been successful in encouraging, European states to increase their own defense spending. But I think that the, continued partnership with the United States on security is very valued within Europe. And he seems to feel quite free and easy about, making these threats about withdrawing U.S. support in Ukraine, withdrawing U.S. support in Europe. And I think these are, very worrying concerns for the European Union. So he could go outside of our traditional, trade negotiations traditionally are focused on trade law. There's also rules on bilateral investment. So another area he could broadly bring in is there's a lot of Europeans who've invested in the United States, corporations and individuals. He could start to make, kind of crazy claims that, he doesn't want European inward investment into the U.S., or he's going to tax that, or he's going to, in other ways, impact the European Union. He's also made these requirements or announced various concerns about the way in which within Europe is regulating its own markets for various types of digital services. So large American providers of digital services, such as like Google providing advertising service, the European Union, is regulating that as a market within Europe. And President Trump is starting to say, well, he's not really happy with what he sees as restrictions on what various American platforms can do in Europe. Now, obviously, European states are democracies. Their voters have voted for certain policies regarding, content restrictions. And you can imagine, like at the extremes, nobody wants child abuse photos online. So if you, have a broad public health, public safety initiative to prohibit certain types of content as being harmful to the population, he's saying he doesn't like those restrictions. And he's saying that's a restriction of free speech. And so this is another issue that, I find it, a bit of an overreach on the part of the United States government to try to regulate what is happening within foreign countries' states regarding their own laws. But he could bring this as an interest to the negotiations and say, I want you to have more relaxed regulation on content that is available to your own citizens. And, I'm going to be very broad and include, in that some types of content that, is abhorrent to people and the democracy is affected.
Okay. And we can't forget China as well, of course. The bulk of the tariffs against China will stay in place. I mean, China made up a bulk of the tariffs, and a bulk of those will stay in place, the so-called Section 301 tariffs, which have raked in $23 billion for the US so far this year, just this Section 301. What effect are you seeing due to the trade war, the tit-for-tat trade war between the US and China? And does this change in the tariff policy with the court ruling make any difference to that whatsoever?
I don't see this as having the largest first order impact. I think at the moment, so I think that the US Congress has been concerned, independent of whatever the president wants, has been concerned about a high rate of import growth from China between, say, 2000 and 2018, when the first round of tariffs went on. And when President Trump left office and a Democratic administration came in, they continued that policy. So one way to see this is there is broad support within US society for these import restrictions on China. And in the face of these high import restrictions, American corporations have begun to find, sources for particular parts and needs in other locations. Mexico, Vietnam are the big countries that have stepped in to bridge that supply gap with China. So I think in the short run, corporations that have now shifted their supply chains to Mexico are probably going to want to continue with those supply chains and not immediately open up to trade with China, because they will be wary of the president going forward with new legislation that specifically targets China, and because the Congress has broadly been supportive of US policy toward China since 2018, you could imagine, much more so than any change in policy against Europe, that's something where if he seeks that, he could get many of his requests met by Congress.
Okay, and just to kind of wrap this up, I suppose, has he managed to gain any significant concessions yet from other countries? So if the emergency tariffs really do end here, was it all worth it?
So I think, one thing that's been happening, if we look at the long history since 2018, a big change that was maybe desirable from the broad US perspective was an increased European investment in Europe's own defense. And that's something, that was achieved. In the short run, has he achieved much out of these, Liberation Day tariffs? And has he gained concessions from different trading partners? I would say not really. He's created a huge amount of, he's destroyed a lot of what we call soft power. And so the US was widely regarded as a reliable partner, both in economic matters and security matters and, various other types of issues like international crime. So he's really destroyed a lot of our trading partners' faith in the United States, but hasn't managed to gain substantial economic concessions for the US. So I think that this, if we look back at this in 10 or 20 years, it's going to look like, to give a parallel, a bit like Brexit, in that the UK, when it left the European Union, was promising itself huge benefits. And then, 10 years later, what you see is low economic growth and a decline in standard of living. So I think it won't be such a dramatic impact maybe as Brexit had on the UK, because the US is not as open an economy before these various attempts by the president began. And the US is a larger economy, it's a bit more self-reliant. But I think the long run answer is this will look, after the fact, very bad for the US that achieved very little in terms of substantial economic concessions from our trading partners.
All right, Meredith Crowley from the University of Cambridge. That was a fantastic insight. Thank you very much for that.